sort of talk for the next sort of half an hour or so in terms of how we here at Infometrics see the economy evolving through all of this and what that means for the Wairarapa economy, with a bit of a touch on each of the key areas, but also then going through and taking your questions and examining some of those key areas that are going to be brought into relief as we go through this COVID-19 pandemic. So kia ora and good afternoon. My name is Brad Olsen. I'm a senior economist here at Infometrics, zooming to you from the lovely Wellington, where we have finally had some rain. I know that all parts of the country are pretty keen on having that good dumping over the weekend. What I do want to do today is just start off at a very high level in terms of how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the globe, having a quick look or a quick discussion around how that is going to impact New Zealand, and then zooming in quite distinctly on the Wairarapa area and considering some of those key drivers as we move through. And with that, I'm also going to share my screen here, which hopefully you will now be able to see, and I'm going to go through this PowerPoint for a bit when it allows me to open up. There we go, cool. All right, so first things first, just wanted to give you that context of how the economy is currently evolving through all of this. At the moment, we've got over 3 million cases worldwide of COVID-19, an incredible amount of disruption to the global economy. And of course, New Zealand as an export trading nation is going to be hit by that. And in fact, we already have been. There's just simply not going to be the same demand for all of our manufactured goods, all of our products that we send overseas, with some of the big players taking some quite sharp hits. Of course, the UK still recording, hundreds of deaths every day, which is quite in contrast to the one additional case that was moved from the probable to the confirmed file here in New Zealand today. So no new case additions for the first time, which is quite an incredible feat. With all of that, though, we are still expecting one of the greatest economic shocks to New Zealand's history since the 1930s Great Depression. This is far, far worse than the global financial crisis. If anything, the GFC looks like a bit of a blip or a walk in the park. So this is going to be fundamentally different. But there are, I guess, although we're aware that the short-term impacts are going to be swift, where the conversation is often moving to now is how long that change is going to come in for. And so on the screen here, I've presented what our expectations are here at Infometrics, where that big, bright, thick orange line, and some of the Treasury scenarios that they put out earlier in April are also on the screen there. Scenario 1 and 2 are some of the, I guess, lesser impacted scenarios, but are also tracking much more closely with how New Zealand's actual cases are developing. You can essentially see there, although we're all picking a pretty sharp downturn to various degrees, what we're expecting is that downturn persists for much longer. Essentially, once you lose so many businesses, once you lose so much spending in the national economy, you simply can't come back to the same degree. You have that self-replicating downward spiral where a bunch of businesses who themselves have gone out of work, the business that they used to provide to another firm is also lost. And so there's that snowball effect that comes in quite a lot. And so that's why we're seeing that this will take really 3.5 years or more before we get to the same sort of economic output that we saw prior to COVID-19. Now, that's much faster than some other forecasters, including Treasury, might have it. Essentially, they're seeing what we economists call a V-shaped recession. It's a sharp downward spike and then a pretty swift recovery that comes through. We just don't think it's going to be quite that rosy. And part of that is because of how that unemployment number is likely to shape up. We're expecting that unemployment could rise to nearly 10%, and to be honest, I suspect we may well revise that number higher. In the last couple of weeks, we've had 30,000 plus people across the country go onto a job seeker support benefit. That's a really, really big rise in the number of people who are accessing state support. And in fact, over half of the working age population across New Zealand is now supported by the government in some way, shape or form, either from the wage subsidy or from the benefit system. So some big changes to how our labour market works. Again, essentially, we're saying that this can't just sort of blow over within a year. with such a rise in people who are going to be out of work, with such a hard time finding new jobs for them, with some sectors just simply not existing to the same degree that they previously have, that has implications for where unemployment moves over time. And essentially, we're not seeing it come back below sort of 8% until probably, end of 2022 almost. Compare that with Treasury, which even under some of their, more optimistic pessimistic scenarios, you can see scenario 1 through there, they're expecting it to be below 8 by the end of 2021. So essentially, within 2 years, everything's fine and dandy. And we just, again, don't see that to be perfectly true. That the scale of disruption, the amount of households that are going to have lower incomes or no jobs, means this is a much longer hit. Now, note, of course, that 10% unemployment doesn't sound possibly particularly that bad. Important to keep in mind that the GFC only ever saw unemployment rise to 6.7%, and that felt like a pretty chaotic time in the economic frame. So again, some really different drivers coming through there. Now, how are we seeing the economy operate at the moment? Now, during level 4, funnily enough, economic activity was curtailed quite significantly. We just didn't have the same level of activity that we previously did. Firms were shut and we only had essential workers or those who can work from home. Now, under level 3, that's lessened up a bit, and our estimates for level 3 indicate that around about 74% of the New Zealand workforce can get back operating, and that, of course, varies depending on what sector you're in. And I think for somewhere like Carterton, I think our numbers are something like 80% off the top of my head. So there are some, I guess, differences around that, but we are getting the economy back into action. However, even at 74, 80%, that's still anywhere between 1/5 and a quarter of the workforce that is still unable to get to work, still unable to earn money, very much still in limbo. I just wanted to show you quickly the share of the different industries that use internet for sales, just because it gives you a bit of a reference point as to how businesses prior to COVID were already coping with, I guess, economic changing times. You can see there, the one I've highlighted in blue is that accommodation and food services sector. Now, Stats NZ estimates point towards that sector having about a 66% internet sales coverage rate, so 66% of businesses could actually go out and sell using the internet. You got to remember, though, that of those, quite a few are accommodation providers who we know aren't able to operate at the moment. And so by our estimates, around about half of that sort of food services, our cafes, our restaurants and that, have any ability to continue operating. So some tough times still for many in our economy. Now, what have we seen coming through in some of the numbers? And I do want to focus, and I know that these are quite high-level numbers here. Now, the Wairarapa is part of the central MSD region, not the most easy to read region considering what it sort of encompasses, but it's worthwhile looking at some of these numbers, understanding, we are seeing thousands of people out of work across each area, and I think in the central region, something like 2,000 additional people have gone on to job seeker support in the last couple of weeks. And again, just that scale of disruption, the number of households that's impacting is quite huge. You can see for Central, down over here, 6.5% now of the working age population in that wider work and income region is now supported by a job seeker benefit. The one I do want to focus on, though, is that 1 percentage point rise. We are seeing a substantial number of people who are not able to operate in the same way. They're having to find government support, and I suspect we may well have this need for government support for some time yet through all of this. Now, one of the areas, and I guess there's two big takeouts for the New Zealand economy generally as we go through COVID, and that is going to reflect whether or not a region is well positioned or not to weather the storm. And those two areas are tourism and the primary sector. Now, if we look at tourism to start with, because it is important to go through how we see some of these elements evolving. So this table, this graph rather here, shows in the orange the proportion of tourist spending in the local area over the 12 months to January 2020, the share of it, in a percentage, and the blue is the international. So you can see that South Wairarapa had the highest concentration of international tourist spending, around about 25% there coming through from international tourists, and a smaller proportion as we get through Carterton and then Marsden. Now, the important points I want to bear out here is that all of the Wairarapa, if we look at it, has a much lower exposure to international tourism than the New Zealand economy generally. So effectively what we're seeing is over the next few years, tourism is going to be a really hard hit industry, but it will be more hard hit in those areas that were already dominated by international tourism. So Rotorua, Queenstown, the West Coast, Mackenzie Country, some of those different areas. Now, there are others across the country who do have a high tourism loading, say Taupo, for example, but they also have a bit more of a focus on that domestic spend, and that's another case for somewhere like the Wairarapa. Tourism is important. You can see they're contributing $205 million of cash into the economy over the year to Jan 2020. That's not any amount you want to lose, but the dominating effect there is coming through from the domestic market. Now, what does that actually mean as we move forward? Well, two things. The first one is that the local economy is not going to be hit as hard as some other parts of the country. Like I say, Queenstown and the West Coast, where the tourist spend makes up anywhere between sort of 35 and 50% of their total economy, that's really hard to claw back. And obviously for your guys' area, it's not quite the same level. It's just not at the same degree. But what is important is every part of the country is now going to be competing for that tourist dollar. We're going to see, Rotorua who's wanting to bridge that gap, because you've got to remember, for example, over the last year, we had around about, I think it was $12-13 billion spent by international tourists in New Zealand. But at the same time, New Zealanders who took money overseas only spent around about $6, $7, $8 billion. So even if you have all of those Kiwis who spend their money locally, you don't have enough to make up the gap. Combine that on top of the fact that New Zealanders are going to have less money to spend on tourism. Everyone's going to be watching their budgets much more closely. That tourist activity is going to be a lot harder to come by. And if everyone's competing for it, it means you've got to make sure your offering is better than others. And so I guess an area of focus probably for the Wairarapa is making sure there's that very strong destination marketing, that there is, I guess, that cohesive voice from the region coming through to make sure that when people are looking for a holiday, are looking for a trip away, that yours is one of the first places on their minds. Now, I say that because I read last week that the Hawke's Bay has come up with a vacation for Wellingtonians. That's their focus when we move into tourism activity a bit more as normal. They're going to try and get all of us from here in Wellington region to go for a vacation. And I guess important to highlight the local beauty and the fantastic sort of access, the fantastic food, the fantastic venues that we have locally in the Wellington region to make sure that we can convert and keep people in the area, keep that money flowing through the economy there. So that's sort of the point on tourism, that while it is going to see a very tough hit, we're not expecting the borders to open for possibly another year, although there might be some movements with Australia. The key driving factor is that there's going to be less money for tourism being spent across the country and much, much more intense competition for that tourist dollar, and so a real coordinated focus being needed through that. Now, if we also look at some of the key sectors for the Wairarapa generally, and again, there's a little bit of difference depending on what part of the Wairarapa we look at, but I think the overall picture is probably the best, otherwise we sort of would spend too long in the nitty-gritty. But the primary bit, or the big bit here, is that the primary sector, that agriculture aspect, is a really important part for the region. It does provide, nearly 16% of all jobs over the last year. Now, that's quite a lot more than the sort of, less than 6% that New Zealand as a whole had from that agri sector. So the importance of primary is very important. We know, for example, that a lot of our meat exports, as well as some of our wine, is going to be quite critical as we move through this. And I suspect one of the big focuses for those exports is going to be understanding how those markets evolve over time. Very much so, I'd expect that those international markets will see a shift. Previously, they may well have been focused on more restaurant trade, for meat, slightly higher quality cuts. For wines, it might be your medium to high level wines or high cost wines. That's going to change a lot in my mind, much more towards people who are going to be eating at home. They're going to be focused a lot more on their household budgets, making sure they keep their costs down. And so an evolution, if you will, towards making sure that people are still able to buy products, but possibly at a lower price point, or by offering a different proposition to them, is going to be quite important there. Now, the likes of healthcare and social assistance, in our mind, that has a little bit more, I guess, stability through all of this downturn. Of course, we do need to make sure our health system is well prepared, I guess, and operating through COVID-19. This is a health pandemic after all. But as we move through this, we are going to see lower levels of some of the discretionary health spending, so physios and some of those other bits and pieces, as well as just a general decline in spending because people don't have as much and will, I guess, try and defer their payments a bit and limit that exposure on the healthcare side. Now, retail, trade, and manufacturing are two interesting elements. They're both going to be hit to a degree by lower output or lower consumption, both here in New Zealand, but also overseas. Effectively, if people don't have as much money in their back pockets, they're just not going to spend to the same degree. And there's going to be a need to be a real focus from local retailers over making sure they can, I guess, demonstrate to people why their products are important, why the goods and services they're selling need to be termed as essential rather than just a nice to have, to make sure that those dollars keeps sloshing through the economy. Now, the construction one is one area I do want to highlight as, I guess, both an opportunity and a risk as we move through this. Now, with tourism losses expected to be large across the country, and that, like I said earlier, that 10% decline nearly in unemployment, that is going to hit household budgets quite considerably. People aren't going to have the same amount of money that they previously did, and we do expect that house prices could well fall by 10, 11% over the next year to year and a half. Now, that lower house price is going to make things a lot more difficult as we go forward for some families who, of course, are going to have those funding struggles. But it also means that lower house prices generally see a decline in housing activity. Those people who are going to build a house, those investors, don't see there to be as good a return as there was previously. They're all going to dampen back just how much they're going to build. So we do expect that construction will also see a bit of a contraction through all of this. Now, I did want to, I guess, highlight that primary sector and just show that actually it is probably one of the key areas of resilience for the economy, particularly in Wairarapa, noting that we've got that nearly 16% of the workforce employed somewhere in that agri sector. Now, important to recognise, because of how large that agri concentration is, that those jobs in the agricultural sector also have positive spin-offs for other parts of the economy. If those agri workers have money in their back pockets, they're going to be willing to spend in the economy. That's going to prop up the level of economic activity in the Wairarapa. Now, of course, that's important as we move through this, and it's important as well that we get support from our exports through this to ensure that that primary sector continues operating. So just a quick graph here showing the level of exports for some of our food stocks and otherwise. This is looking at the total over the last 3 months almost now of our trade exports, the value of what we're sending overseas. You can see that the likes of dairy is holding slightly above that 0% mark. It's still in slight growth mode, around about 4 or 5%. Now, both meat and if you will, our total exports are slightly below that 0%. They've declined a little bit over the month and 2 months or so that we've had since the start of February. A little bit of a softer profile for our exports there. But that's not unexpected. We were seeing that as global demand does dry up, as everyone else across the world is in lockdown, that focus on, or I guess a need to reduce spending levels has hit economic activity. That has seen our exports go lower. What this does show, though, is that it could have been a lot worse. You can see forestry, for example, declining 40% from the same time last year in a really hard place, whereas our meat exports, although they have gone down, are still holding at a relatively stronger level than some of our other export commodities. So I guess just highlighting that primary sector resilience, it's not going to be a fun ride, don't get me wrong, but it is in our minds going to provide a much more stable economic foundation from which we can relaunch the economy off the back of this. I guess I touched on that construction point before, but what I guess I will highlight here is, although these are looking at our national expectations for standalone for some of our housing needs, and you can see that the number of houses we're going to build is going to soften considerably. We expect it could well halve within the next sort of 1.5 to 2 years across the country. But there is that added advantage or potential for the government to start coming in with more money for infrastructure. We do expect that private-based building construction, so residential investors alongside non-residential activity, commercial businesses and that, are not going to be building to the same degree that they have previously. But in our minds, the Wairarapa has a real chance to get a bit more infrastructure investment to get things going. And I know there's been quite a lot of talk in recent times around water storage. It's a very common conversation I had with Northland as well last week around that need to make sure they have access to water facilities throughout to enable and maintain the livelihoods of a lot of people in the local area. And with the government needing to find these additional projects to get going, to keep people in jobs, in our minds, that infrastructure does provide a real opportunity through this. But, and this is the big but, the focus on how we actually get that money and ensuring it gets delivered quickly is going to be critical. I'll show you this graph, and it's not the most enamoring graph ever, but it shows the amount of funding that the Provincial Growth Fund has announced in those orange bars, and in the blue bars you'll see the amount of funding it's actually paid out. And these figures down the bottom here for the Kapiti Wairarapa region, that's how PDU chunks them up. And effectively, we're seeing that the area has seen only about $12.5 million apparently allocated to it, but of that, less than $3 million has actually been paid out as at the end of February. So a very low amount still of money that's getting into the community. And in our minds, there's a real risk there that the slow spending by the government could well hamper that ability to, I guess, stimulate that activity if there's not the level of coordination that we need going through all of this. Now that's sort of most of my presentation, because there are a few other bits though that I did just want to highlight quickly in terms of how we anticipate this economic hit will go. And there is, I guess, a real need to be aware of how it will affect certain groups. Now, we know, for example, that during the global financial crisis, Māori employment across the country dipped by 6.3%. Now, for non-Māori, it was down by, I think, less, it was something like 1.9, 1.8%. So Māori during the global financial crisis saw a 3 times larger hit than the rest of the economy. And we expect that could well come out again this time. Same thing for young people who already have a higher unemployment rate. We do expect that those young people across the economy who are likely to be in more low-skilled jobs, who have just come out of school or education, who haven't got the full level of experience as some other workers, they are going to feel this disproportionately. They will see some of the higher levels of unemployment, and that's going to be a real struggle as we try and get them back into operations. So with all of that in mind, and before I sort of start taking some of your questions, I guess I just wanted to offer a few bits and pieces, a few ideas about what we need to see coming through over the next few years. Now, as I noted right at the start, we're going to have this much higher level of unemployment, much lower level of people participating in the economy. Now, because it's going to be a good couple years before the economic engine really starts to regain that momentum and is running hot again, what I do think is we've got to make sure that we keep people in a work-ready state. We don't want them going off and becoming long-term dependents of the government. We want to make sure that when there is a job, that they're able to get back into it very swiftly. And I think there's some real opportunities through this for a more community-led approach to make sure there's volunteering opportunities that will give people in the region an ability to maintain their structure, to continue operating with people, gives them great experience with people and others. All of those sort of elements will become really critical. Importantly, we're also going to need a strong education focus on this. And I know there's already been conversations around the Regional Skills Leadership Group in the Wairarapa. Now, in my mind, that's got a real key focus through all of this. If we don't get those settings right, if we don't ensure that people, both young and those who have lost their jobs otherwise because of COVID, have access to education, it's going to be a real hard slog to get them going again, to get them positioned for I guess what that new future employment is going to look like. Now, the last point I'll leave you with, and I guess a bit of an opportunity for the medium term, the next 5 to 7 years or so, is that what COVID has taught us is that actually staying in an office all of the time is not quite as critical to business as we all might have thought prior to this pandemic. When push comes to shove, there are a lot of businesses across the country that can work from home. In fact, by our estimates, the national average was around about 29% of workers could operate from their homes in some way, shape, or form. Now, with that, and noting that the Wairarapa has some fantastic lifestyle opportunities and actually some really good transport connections, you do begin to wonder if there's an opportunity for increased remote working. Someone goes into the Wellington office once, maybe twice a week, but is able to live in the Wairarapa, has those travel connections, but can have a much lower price point as we move through this. Their living costs are lower, housing is cheaper, but they also get that ability to work from home and using the good connections in the local area. So in my mind, and I guess that my summary points here, this is going to be a huge economic hit, not only on New Zealand, but also on the Wairarapa. I don't think there's any regions that are going to not feel a severe amount of pain to their economy through this. It is going to hurt. It is going to see a number of people who are going to be left unemployed. But at the same time, the Wairarapa isn't as exposed to some of the key drivers of the downturn as other regions. Tourism is not the same as in Wairarapa as it is in Queenstown and other areas, and that greater focus on domestic tourism is going to, I guess, shield the Wairarapa from increased levels of unemployment, of job losses. But as we move through this, there is going to be a real need to coordinate that local response to make sure there is some clear destination planning going on so that when visitors from across New Zealand are ready to travel again, that the Wairarapa is one of their top spots on the list to go to. The great New Zealand road trip, I suspect, is about to be reborn. At the same time, that focus on the primary sector is going to be a real critical area. It's going to prop up the economy and, in my mind, hold up that foundation a lot better than other parts of the economy might. That's not to say it is going to remain unscathed, and I know that there's a number of concerns around agri at the moment with the drought across the North Island. But in the same regard, it does have, I guess, that economic foundation that other sectors don't through all of this. And of course, that opportunity to actually get more investment in the local area, to keep people and get more people back into work, that focus on infrastructure will require a really strong voice to government. A really important element to that is going to be that regional leadership, making sure that every leader at every turn understands what's at stake and understands how to get the best for the region. So look, with that, I'll sort of hand back over to all of you to unmute yourselves as you see fit and to ask some questions, and I'll be very happy to take them. Don't everyone speak at once.
I'll start. Can you hear me all right there, Brad?
Yes, I can, Rob.
Okay, so it's Rob Sockley from Carterton District Council. Over the last decade, we've seen internal migration from the big population centres out to the provinces. Do you see that continuing, reducing, changing at all?
Yeah, so I think in the short term, I'm much more uncertain about where that goes, and I guess there's two competing things there. One is that people may well stick where they are for longer just because of that uncertainty. Do you want to move? Yes, you might have, say, lost your job or having to take reduced hours, but do you want to actually move while that uncertainty persists? Probably not. So on one hand, I could see there to be that sustained, a bit lower internal migration across the country as people sort of just stay where they are for the next year or so, assess what's happening, and then figure out their next steps. But over that sort of short to medium term, I do wonder if there is more scope for internal migration to at least continue, if not pick up a little bit more, with that ability for remote working or working from home for a longer period. Like I said, I think the Wairarapa in general has quite a strong attraction to that, with Wellington as well likely to do not as badly as some other areas. Sure, there is more tourism in Wellington City, for example, but at the same time, there are a lot more government workers and those sort of professionals who may well think, well, yes, I'm getting paid all right at the moment, but how do I make sure I'm saving up a bit more for the next pandemic? I need to find a cheaper place to live. I want to make sure that I've got a good lifestyle for my family. And if I was them, the Wairarapa looks very attractive. Now, I say that, Rob, because one of my boss, actually, the managing director of Infometrics, does exactly that. He commutes in normal times, at least, once or twice a week and works from home the other 3 days or so. So it is a well-established model, and I guess making it clear to people in that marketing just what that proposition is. How long does it take to get to Wellington City on the train? How much cheaper are your household bills and that sort of thing could well be, I guess, a good feather in the cap for the area to try and attract more people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Hi, Alex. Is that Alex?
Yes, it is.
Brilliant.
Yep, I did type in a question, but I'll ask it as well. Is the concept of buy local, which we're currently looking at, a valid proposition, or when I did economics at university with regards to specialisation, it was always seen as potentially a damaging thing for the economy overall. Could you comment?
Yeah, so if we were to turn fully protectionist over the next 5-10 years, it would be damaging for the economy. We absolutely need to make sure that we are still trading with overseas, and that's simply because we're good at making some things here in New Zealand, and it's a bit too expensive to make others. And so to keep that in mind over the medium term is important. Now, there's a little bit of a difference in the next sort of 6 months or so because of how snarled up some of the supply chains are, and also just how hard it is to move stock and product around. And I do think in the next 6 months or so, there is a focus or more of a focus on that buy local. Now, I say that because if we look at some of the, this might be a cliche, but it's certainly one of the reasons I love coming over to the Wairarapa, is you guys have some fantastic retail stores and sort of food and hospitality areas. I love going to the cheese shop on the way out to a friend's batch at Riversdale. Now, I say that because for some people across, say, the Wellington region in general, they may well only explore some of those areas as they come across them in the car. Now, if they're not driving around as much, if they're not going on that travel, it's going to be very hard for them to connect to some of those local producers who they just might not know about in other times. It's not the sort of thing you type in www.cheese.nz. So with that in mind, I think there is a need over the next 6 months or so to provide some of our retailers with that breathing room to keep their operations going to a degree. And I think, Alex, that the point I'd make with trying to enable that is having a really strong support for those retailers to have an online presence. Making sure they can actually be found is quite important. And I've really liked in Wellington City, and I can't remember sort of how far this is extended to, but there's some, I think it's like Love Local or something, where you can get local Wellington products, that are made here that you might not otherwise think to buy, and so get some good gift baskets. It's some of those elements, I think, that will keep some of our retailers in a better position. But over the longer term, as we return towards what we're sort of terming the new normal, I think we will naturally start to trade again with the world, because the world will want our stuff and we'll want what the world has to offer. I also noticed that there were a few questions and answers put in the chat, so apologies for that. I didn't quite see them. I'll answer Marie Claire's question around mental health and some of the health data that we try and monitor. Now, what's been very apparent over the weekend, bit of a Twitter political firestorm, if you will. There were some claims about mental health numbers rising or not. The difficult thing with health data is until COVID-19 came along, it's actually been really difficult to understand any of our health data. We now get a daily case update on COVID. When we ask, though, how many people might be accessing mental health services across an area, a lot of the data that we're able to get at a national level only seems to come out once a year or so. Turning aside from that for a second, I think there's a real ability for some of our local DHBs to provide much more granular data to some of the organisations on this call in a much more timely manner. Some of the things I would focus on is, suicides are always an area that people want to look at. I think just as important as making sure that we're aware of how many mental health call-outs or mental health presentations we're seeing in the community, what is that load looking like and how might it be shifting? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? What sort of changes are coming through there? That's sort of one of the critical ones, just to keep an eye on what's happening there. I suspect as well we might want to, and this is not quite health data but more social demographic data, just keep an eye on some of those vulnerable communities that we know are out there, particularly around how people are able to pay their housing costs, as well as the likes of the number of food baskets or similar or budgeting services that people are looking for. We are going to see quite a reduction in incomes across the country, and the Wairarapa will be no different. And just trying to make sure that where people have got lower incomes, incomes, that they are able to access those services will be quite important as we move through this. The other question coming through from Phoebe around building consents and, you know, what if that's going to be a consistent decrease across different regions, or if it's going to be felt more in some of the main centres. I think it's a bit of both. What we're generally expecting is that there will be, and actually we were already prior to COVID expecting a bit of a decline in construction activity. Now that's simply because we've started to build so many houses coming through. We've consented nearly 38,000 over the next year. The key drivers in my mind for whether or not construction will hold up better or worse in a local area is a couple of things. The first one is, what is that exposure or that downturn likely to look at? If we have a higher expectation of unemployment than some other areas, then I think there will be, greater house price declines and lower levels of construction. Now, noting that the Wairarapa doesn't have the same concentration of tourism spending, it's not going to be quite the worst. I think it's possibly sitting more sort of middle of the pack-ish in my mind with some of the activities going on. Now, at the same time, one of the things I would be looking for with that construction is what else is coming through in the local area to drive activity. Now, we noted earlier that that internal migration has been quite an important point. Prior to COVID, one of the big drivers, nationally at least, was that high net migration number coming through from overseas. Now we're expecting that to dip away quite considerably. That's just going to lower the general demand for housing, but I do wonder if with people looking for that lifestyle choice, if the Wairarapa's numbers might hold up better. As well as that, there's obviously some pretty core civic projects and some of the wider infrastructure stuff that might be coming through as well, particularly around the train tracks and some of the other civic buildings in the wider region. Those are going to support more of the workforce, but I guess the point I'd want to caution when everyone thinks about the importance or the ability for infrastructure to be the saviour is that it may well keep the current construction sector employed, but there might not be a huge amount of growth anytime soon for construction moving through. Happy to take some more of your questions though. We've got another sort of 20 minutes if anyone has bits and pieces they want to discuss. Jane, I see, is that a hand up or no? Bridget, looks like you might have been about to say something.
Hi there. Willie Beetham, who works for Federated Farmers, was saying that someone who owns merino kids and they couldn't get their materials from overseas, so they've put the word out and managed to get some here. In fact, the whole supply chain can now be done in New Zealand. Now, I don't know about costs because he didn't talk about those, but I wondered if you'd come across any other models like that or what you think about that sort of scenario where...
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, even on the cost element, yes, it might cost more, but it probably costs less than doing nothing and producing nothing if your supply chain's broken. And I think that's one of the key drivers of this is that, look, in economics, and allow me to bore you and lecture you for a moment, what we generally see during an economic downturn is what we term a demand side shock. We have a decrease in the amount of stuff that people want to buy. Now, that means that the way you get out of that, if you will, is to get people more confident and willing to spend in the economy. Now, what we haven't seen since the sort of the 1970s oil shocks is what we've currently got, which is a supply issue. That supply side shock means that even if we did want to buy everything, and we don't, but if we did, it's simply not there to get. And so that one's quite a lot harder because you're right, we have to find new ways of operating. We've got to substitute some of the inputs we have. And I think this will see some companies looking around a lot more at who's actually in that local area and who's providing. And I guess what that anecdote as well, Bridget points out, is that some firms are not as aware as we might expect of what that local environment looks like, who else might be out there in the community to provide. And I guess that's where, in many respects, some of the really critical work that councils, that EDAs, that other organisations can provide through COVID-19 is making sure there is that local coordination, so that when a business comes looking, they want to figure out, who's got some possible workers that they can take on, who has that new supply chain, who has that product to offer, that they can find that answer quickly and instead of having to sort of hunt around or reinvent the wheel. That's, in my mind, a really key focus as we look at these supply chains, is how do we make sure that that coordination is happening both across the region but also across the sort of the wider area. And I dare suspect that some of our councils, both the elected members but also senior leadership, as well as the EDA partners across the area, will have contacts throughout the region and throughout the country as well to be able to, I guess, matchmake a little bit more for businesses.
Matchmake, yeah, that's good.
I think I saw before all of COVID turn up, someone termed, there was a new app that they'd termed Tinder for tourism. So, you know, it seems to be a catching on the matchmaking element. Any other questions that people want to pop in, either in the, I see there might have been a few more coming in the Q&A actually. I'll answer those ones briefly. Okay, so the first one is around tax implications going forward. So this has been an interesting point that's come through in the last sort of 3-4 weeks. What does the massive ramping up in government spending mean for the fiscal books? So we are spending a huge amount more money. The government, just before Parliament rose, before level 4 lockdown, was authorised to spend $52 billion if they wanted to. An incredible amount of money, given it was all emergency spending. Now, in our minds, this is going to see the government's debt numbers rise quite considerably, but we can do that. We can go to about 30% of debt to GDP during normal times. We're around about 20 already, so we're in a good starting place. We could well go to 50% debt to GDP by the end of this, you know, during a time of crisis. Now, that gives you sort of at least $90 billion of additional spending that you might want to make. But as we go through this, and when I say go through this, I'm thinking more sort of 5-7 years into the future. The focus becomes, how do we rebuild that pandemic insurance that we're effectively spending out? And there's 3 phases to this in my mind. The first one is the response. That's where we're currently in and will be in for the next 12 months. How do we keep the lights on? How do we get the economy operating at some sort of level? That you know, it's very much just maintaining momentum. The second part, that recovery phase, how do we get the economy moving again? How do we get it back up to somewhat of a normal pace? How do we reinvigorate that spending element and getting people out and confident, both businesses and households? The third part, which is sort of, you know, 5, 7, maybe a few more years in the future, is how do we also ensure that people are able to repay that? Now, does that mean we have higher income taxes? Does it mean we have to consider the possibilities of environmental or wealth taxes? I think there will be quite a few options on the table to make sure that people are able to repay this. Government's going to need to be able to rebuild its books. In my mind, though, that's sort of away for a while. It won't be something that comes in anytime soon, because too soon and it would just kneecap any economic recovery we might come seeing in there. A question from Jane, thanks Jane, around sort of event-based activities and Wairarapa being quite events-based. And what does that mean for event organisers as we move through this? Look, I think there's going to be some real differences coming through over the next wee while over how people interact, how people feel they might want to go to events, what precautions they might take, how difficult they might feel it to be to go to an event and remain safe. And so I think some really clear messaging around what steps are being put in place to ensure that attendance at events is safe, and that if events happen, you know, if issues happen at those events, that there is good contact tracing in place. All of those sort of bits and pieces will ensure that people have a greater propensity to engage, a greater ability to feel like they want to go back to those events. I think as well, there's going to be a real need to enable you know, a bit more of a social vibe throughout New Zealand. We've all been cooped up for far too long. We've been without our friends. We haven't been able to go and grab a coffee or you know, a scone to eat. That sort of element is going to mean that people are going to be wanting an outlet that is still safe. And in my mind, for domestic tourists, that focus is going to be, how do I make sure that I can get around, that I can do things on my own, but I have a good menu of options. We're going to see a lot more people, in my mind, driving about to different places for different events. That focus for event organisers, I think, is going to be, why is this event special? Why is this event unique? What more do I get out of it from going to an event than just driving around on my own and seeing the wonders of the local area? So I think making it a real destination to go to, making it a real showstopper to get people back in is going to be important, while retaining that important healthcare element. Making sure there is those protections in place will be quite key. There's an interesting question coming in here around, what happens if we may well have, I guess, cascading emergencies going on. We know that just because we're in the middle of a pandemic, we don't have any relief from the possibility of an earthquake or similar hitting. And I think the key thing here, in terms of how we would respond to all of these different events if they came at once, is that we do have some good coordination that's already going on amongst our regional, our national partners to make sure that we're as well prepared for another shock if it were to come in. And you saw a little bit of that coming through in Wellington City when there were issues with the south coast and a huge amount of swells taking out some of the houses and that. We do still have our civil defence planning well in place. We know what it takes to get through these things, and if anything, I think it would just show that resilience that everyone has. Would it be difficult to cope through? Absolutely. Very, very difficult one to go through a pandemic at the start, particularly when people are already feeling isolated, a lot more anxious, a lot more uncertain about where the future's going, and an earthquake or something similar would do that. I guess what we've got to have coming through, and a really key part that I've been talking to business leaders across the Wellington region about for the last couple of weeks, is that through all of this, it's important that those regional leaders have two things. One, a plan, and two, something to communicate that plan. As we move through this, that coordination at a very strategic level becomes even more critical than in normal times. Making sure there is a one-stop shop, one mouthpiece, or one story being told across the country to ensure that, or across the region rather, to ensure that those businesses, that those households understand what is happening, what some of the changes are, what they need to be aware of. That's important. But making sure there's a plan as well, instead of sitting back and waiting for everything to go to blow over, having something that people can grasp hold of to understand how they can best interact, how they can best make their own plans around the wider strategy for the region. All of those things become important. And I guess the risk is, if we don't have those plans, or if they happen at too much of a local level without, I guess, looking up above the top of the trenches to understand what the region's doing, is you could well duplicate resources, you could well essentially compete against each other. So I think there's a real need, and actually already a really strong voice coming from the Wairarapa. Now, you notice I say the Wairarapa rather than the Wellington region. Of course, I think they are different, but often not well conceptualized. And so that strength of planning is going to be a really important point, just so that people have the confidence that those who are in power, those who are making the decisions, those who have the money, are able to best execute that plan. That will get businesses who may want to invest quicker than otherwise. It's going to ensure that households also stick around in the area a lot more. The question here from Rob around what we might see if we move back to alert level 4 in terms of the long-term prospects and that. And in fact, essentially this question closed out, and it's a fair point. Would we see even worse economic effects, or have we sort of already seen them? It's actually the former. If we were to go back into level 4 lockdown, that would fundamentally shift the economic dial. It would make this downturn so much harder to pull ourselves out of. And that's because, shutting down the economy, you lose so much momentum. And for businesses who have already been struggling to move through these economic effects, to keep their doors open, to make sure that they keep their staff employed, this would just be a hammer blow for a lot of them who aren't able to operate to the same degree under level 4. Now, by our estimates, only around about half of the workforce in most areas can actually go to work during level 4, either because they're an essential service or because they're able to work from home. So when you're sort of, tying an arm and a leg behind someone's back and telling them to go for a full sprint, you just don't get the same level of economic activity. And that hinders us more as we go through the future. We're already going to be dropping as a country around about 5% minimum of our economic activity just from tourism. That simply won't be the same. Now, that cascading effect of further lockdowns could well see more businesses close. That has another implication where the businesses who have just closed, they are now not providing the same custom to a second layer of businesses who are going to see reduced incomes as well. And so it does, I guess, vibrate out from there. It's like throwing a pebble into a lake. Those reverberations that you see coming through can hit the economy quite hard. So if we were to have to revert back to level 4, the economic shock of that would be quite considerable. And I think that's why, in many respects, as painful as it was to go through level 4, the sooner we can get rid of COVID-19, the faster we can start that economic recovery, the more chance we have of saving more businesses and keeping more people in employment. Yeah, so as Rob said, it's critical we make this work. Absolutely. If we get this one wrong, we sort of lock in a longer and lower path to recovery. The faster we get through it, the faster we're actually able to get the economy moving again. I see Dave coming in with a hi. Dave, do you want me to unmute you so you can say something, perhaps, if I can do that? I've unmuted you now, Dave, if you wanted to ask a question.
I was just thinking about that, and have you in Infometrics done any modelling in terms of if we had to return to a level 4, if we had a cluster outbreak at some point during level 3 or level 2, returning to level 4, is the impact on the economics for another 4-week lockdown, is it substantially greater? Is it a magnitude? Is it more order of magnitude in terms of a recovery, or is it our recovery is what it will be, and it won't make have much of an impact?
We haven't specifically modelled it, but having been involved with our original modelling of how the economy is going to go, and effectively what we've said over the next year is that we're assuming a level 4 lockdown for 4.5 weeks, a level 3 lockdown for sort of 3 weeks or so, and then level 2 to level 1. We haven't given too much of an allowance of how specific level 1 or level 2 operates, because they do seem to be slightly lower. But I can say that reduction to output is quite considerable, just as a standalone. So like I said, if you're taking half of the workforce out of operation for four weeks or so, that does diminish your ability to get back into operations quickly. So on the face of it, you've got quite a large reduction. Now, if you were to have to go back to COVID alert level 4 again, I would expect that the downturn would be even more substantial. Now, it would take the total level of activity lower, so that gives you a lower starting point for recovery, if you will. But in my mind, it would also see a jump in the number of businesses that are going to have to close and the number of people that are going to be laid off. And that quantity increase in unproductive workers or people who just can't operate to the same degree, that would see that level of operation take a lot longer to return. Effectively, you've sort of got this momentum element, the inertia of the economy, and if you slow it too much, it's really quite difficult to get going again. And I guess that's the point. That's why we've said it. We expect that unemployment could well rise to 10%. Now it's currently at 4%, so a 6 percentage points rise in the next year. But it could well take a good 3 years to get it down by the same degree. Effectively, it's much easier to increase, much harder to decrease the number of people out of work. So on my mind, it would make the recovery substantially harder. It would mean that we would have a much softer economy. It would see a lot more people out of work than even if we were to continue at level 3 for a period longer. A question coming in as well from Jane around I guess, how consumers are going to respond to this, and will we see a move towards online retail that's sustained, or are we all going to start going back to brick and mortar shops? I think there are going to be some real big changes through all of this. The most critical one in my mind is that you've got to remember that prior to COVID-19, over the last decade or so, New Zealand's retail spending has often been what I'd call sort of a volume sell model. Effectively, we've had very low profit margins on a lot of the stuff we've sold in retail operations. And instead, we've relied on just getting a lot of product out the door. Having lots of sales coming through, that will boost the amount of return we're getting. Now, we were already expecting that consumer spending was going to soften, and we just didn't have the same level of population growth. So that volume turnover wasn't going to be the same. Now, that's even more true with the likes of COVID, that people are not going to be spending to the same degree. So that's going to hurt some of our retailers. Now, at the same time, we're expecting that I guess it won't be a full reduction across the board in brick and mortar stores and a complete shift to online only. What I do think we will see through this is a real shift in what consumers want to buy or have the money to spend on. There's going to be a focus first and foremost to pay the food bills, to pay the mortgage, to pay some of the other essentials, childcare and what have you. A lot of that other discretionary spending, to having a coffee out, going to a cafe, a pub, a restaurant, getting some new clothes, some new electronics, some new goods, those bits of spending, are going to be much harder to come across. They're going to be a much smaller proportion of what households are willing to spend. That's going to, in my mind, see how retailers have to focus a lot bigger on how to get people in their door, how to make sure that people are willing to spend. It's going to mean that retailers are going to have to focus much more on I guess, what value can they offer to their clients? How do they make sure that when someone is looking to buy a good or a service from company ABC, that company ABC demonstrates that this is more of an essential than a nice to have? What is that additional value that people see? In my mind, there is, I guess, scope for that additional shift towards online retailing, people finding it so much more convenient. But at the same time, I think there is also going to be a want to remain somewhat social as we go through and we get out of this. So I don't think we'll see a full reversion to online spending, but I don't also think we'll just go back to full brick and mortar stores. I think there's probably a new equilibrium that settles a little bit closer to the online retailing. I think that the important one will be whether or not that online retailing is bought from New Zealand or from overseas stores. And I think at the moment there's a bit more of a bias towards overseas prior to COVID. I wonder if that dial shifts a bit more back towards Kiwi retailers in the next wee while. We've still got a few couple minutes. A question coming in here from Robin around, what our expectations are for the borders and some of those changes. So our expectation is that the borders remain closed for the next 12 months or so. Now, like I said, there's a bit of conversation around whether or not we have a shared trans-Tasman bubble with Australia. I find that one a little bit hard to understand how it would work if we look at how COVID alert levels look like prior to lockdown. Under level 3, we couldn't even have non-essential travel across regions. So I don't quite understand how we could have a shared bubble with Australia, but not be able to drive from Wellington to the Manawatu for non-essential travel. So I'm still struggling with how exactly that might work. And I think it might just be that we're able to have a little bit more interaction and that we slowly, I guess, normalize relations there. In terms of what that border opening could look like, is it going to be a full opening, or are we going to see some restrictions and I guess different countries that we're engaging with? I think it's going to be more that second one. We're going to be very cautious about re-importing COVID-19 cases. We're going to try and stick away from that as much as possible. And so I suspect we may well start to open our borders more with some of those countries who are seeing lower case numbers, Australia, possibly Singapore and others. I wonder as well if there's an opportunity to, I guess, reopen the borders in a slightly different way. Instead of just everyone coming in into New Zealand and having to quarantine for 12 days or something, we have people who fly to Singapore, they stay a night in a hotel and they have a test before they enter. So they have a test. If the next morning their test comes back clear, they hop on the plane to New Zealand. Again, when they get to New Zealand, they go into a quarantine hotel. They have another test. The next morning they get that test back. If they're clear, off they go for a bit, and we can trace them if we need to. But some of those are, I guess, changing abilities to track and understand where people have come from will be important to making sure we can get that activity going again. Importantly, though, even if we do get our tourism settings a little bit back towards normal, we are, in our minds, going to see a much reduced pattern of travel for a few reasons. One, we are expecting that we're going to see a global recession. That's less money that's going to be coming through from a lot of our international partners. Two, we're going to see a reduction in actual airline travel because a number of companies that are going to be operating, the cheapness of the flights and the routes that they're able to fly are going to be much more reduced. So all of those say that even if we could get the same level of demand from people who want to fly, the ability for airlines and that to supply that level of demand is much more diminished. Again, it comes down to some of those supply chain effects moving through. And then probably the final question for this one is one from Rob around the dependence of New Zealand's recovery on how the global economy rebounds. I think, look, we are a trade-oriented economy. It is critical for our success, our future, that we're able to send stuff overseas that people pay a price for them. So to a degree, our economic fortunes are interlinked with global recovery. Now, the only caveat I'd put around that is that we're not quite as closely tied as, say, Australia or some of the other countries who have a much harder commodity focus around trying to supply inputs for manufacturing. We provide food a lot of the time, and you've got to remember that regardless, countries are going to still need to eat, and we provide some high quality food, some very safe food that people will look to after a pandemic. And so I think in that regard, that's why I see the primary sector as having a little bit more strength through all of this. It's not going to be a nice ride, but I do expect that some of our exports will hold up better even in the face of a global recession than some other areas. So we will be dependent on how the world evolves through this, but we have, I guess, a little bit more resilience to that downturn than other parts of the world who, if they can't manufacture goods for China or the US or Europe, they're going to see a much harder stance. We're able to still provide food regardless, possibly at a lower price point, but also with a lower New Zealand dollar to aid our exporters. So a bit of a balance between all of those. Look, I think we'll leave it there. It's been fantastic to be able to provide some insights to you guys today. I hope they have been insightful. I'll make sure I provide a copy of these slides to Bridget and her team so that they can provide them out to you guys. If you have any questions, please do get in touch. Always happy for a yarn over the phone or similar. And look, keep safe out there and all the best in all of the work that you guys are doing to keep the Wairarapa going well. And when travel time comes back again, I will well be back to spend a few dollars in the local economy and make sure that I'm doing my part for domestic tourism. So thanks everyone, and we'll catch you guys a bit later.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brad.
Cheers.
Bye.